Welcome to you as we continue our discussion of the laying a foundation for our spiritual disciplines. And we just have 2 more weeks of this, and then we will begin our first month of actually practicing a discipline. And I think it's going to be a great one because it's going to be about taking a nap. That is right. Rest, Sabbath will be the first discipline that we look at. Now, this week though, we're still continuing to lay that foundation, and each week I highly encourage you to read Gretchen Renovick's book Ragged, and she is by far the best author that I found out there that doesn't descend into some sort of semi-Pelagianism, but really keeps grace not only as the forefront, but as the empower. She just understands that grace is not only our foundation, but it is the thing that empowers us, and in fact, it is our goal. That we would grow more and more of our understanding and deeper in our experience of God's grace for us. Now, I especially want to highlight her book this week and recommend and commend it to you because this week she talks about authority, privilege, and submission. And she's speaking out of her own experience as a mother married to a farmer trying to raise a young family. And I'm not going to attempt to dive into her discussion of the challenges of being a wife and a mother, as I don't want to mansplain, and more importantly, I don't want to do an injustice to what she's to what she's saying there, due to me having just absolutely no experience as a wife and a mother. And she writes some really profound things, so I would just commend that to your reading. Martin Luther had this to say about the Christian life. A Christian is perfectly free, Lord of all, subject to none. A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. And we've talked a lot about freedom so far in our discussion of disciplines, and that is certainly not going to change. What we are going to look at today is maybe a little more closely at the dual nature of freedom. And what I mean by that is that freedom, that there's a freedom from something, but then there also is a freedom to something. And another way to think about that is that when Paul says that we're no longer under the law, it means we're no longer under judgment for our sin. We are free of that judgment. And it also means that we are free to no longer sin. Freedom's just not about doing anything you think you might want to do. Shall we therefore go on sinning so that grace may abound? Of course not. That sin is slavery, and so true freedom is to not sin, to live as God created us. And so what that means in terms of our discussion today is that we are, of course, free to practice or not practice the spiritual disciplines. God does not mandate that we have to do these things or that we won't be saved or that he'll somehow love us more. And that freedom has another side to it. And it is that we are set free to practice the disciplines, not as slaves, but as sons and daughters. And here's the really tricky thing about freedom, that it moves things out of the realm of the world of necessary or essential into the world of want. And most of us have a very weird relationship with the things that we want. Things that are necessary and demand our time and attention and our resources, but our wants are something that we tend to put on the back burner. And how many of you learned some version of the saying that God doesn't give us what we want, but what we need? And so we learn very quickly to doubt our wants. And furthermore, this really teaches us not to ask God for anything but the bare minimum, right? Because he's just always going to give us what we need, kind of like a very stern grandfather who says, eat your vegetables. And so is it any surprise that people have such a difficult time asking others for help? And, add to this that most of us live in worlds that demand so much of us. Our employers put incredible pressure and unrealistic demands on us on a regular basis, and this, of course, is only trumped by the demands we put on ourselves. We fear appearing weak or needy because people will take advantage of us, and some people do. And we have this image of God who will sternly not give us what we're asking for, but what we really need, maybe with a stern look or a slight lecture. And I get it. Like, I really do. There are any number of things that I would love to do, taking a nap being the foremost. But there are kids to take care of. And the kids certainly aren't going to feed themselves, and the house isn't going to clean itself, and the grass isn't going to cut itself. So let's not pretend like we live in a world where we can just suddenly drop everything. But let's also be honest about our willingness to play the martyr rather than asking for help. We have to be honest about how many items on our to-do list are there because of we won't do them then. And the then is really about the worth and value we find in doing things, in being needed, and being the only one who can do it. And so my point is not to shame anyone who does this, but to say that the gospel offers you something so much more than playing the martyr. Come at it from a different angle. Consider the story of A.W. Tozer, who you may have heard of. He was a much celebrated pastor, speaker, teacher, and mentor of so many in the Christian faith. And he worked tirelessly and was celebrated for his piety and refusing to take royalties for his books, and instead just giving them away. And he didn't really take much for speaking, etc. And it all sounds so pious, doesn't it? It all sounds so incredibly Christian, but this is there in the past, but if you would have talked to his wife and kids, you would have heard about a wife who was alone with little financial resources and several little children who never saw their father. As one biographer wrote, the scope of Tozer's ministry militated against the wholesome family life. Speaking engagements meant that he was away more than he was home. When he was actually in the house, he was in his bedroom studying, reading, or writing. And so Tozer's not alone in this. You've heard this story before of very pious Christian leaders who cared for so many but not their family. And it certainly gives the appearance of a deep and profound spirituality, does it not? I mean, to give his royalties away, that seems so pious. But it left his family destitute. And so what was driving him was not piety. And I say this with all due respect, but he did not actually really understand what Christian spirituality, Christian maturity is all about. And I can say that with confidence because the fruit of his spirituality was the neglect of those who were placed in his care. That is not to say that he was not saved or that he was not trying to live a faithful life. It is to say that someone in his life should have smacked him upside the head and said, knock it off. Stop making this all about you. Take care of your family. Do you want to know what God is calling you to? It is to love God, to love your neighbor, and so love your family. And that brings us back to that quote from Luther, that we are free in our Christian life. And a significant part of that freedom is that we are free to love others. The spiritual disciplines are personal. They're something that we practice, but they are practiced in a community. And our practice does not pull us away from the community, but deeper into it. Because we will need the support of each other in order to be able to practice them. Husbands and wives need to help each other carve out much needed time, and churches should look at things like providing childcare, or maybe going to young families rather than always saying, come to us, and maybe finding ways to care for young families rather than guilting them about not doing enough. And you and I, we all need people in our life to gently say, knock it off, when you start making your practice of the disciplines all about you. Now, one very, very important note here. We do not force feed anyone in the church. We invite people, which is why any serious practice of Christian disciplines is rooted in word and sacrament. We need these tangible reminders of God's grace and goodness and provision in our lives to know that we are invited each week to a feast on Sundays, where we can all come with our individual needs and wants, and that we are all met by the same grace and mercy of God, who gives us freely to each one of us, meeting not only our needs, but our wants. And this, only this understanding of God's grace and mercy, give us a proper orientation for our